Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I am excited to be here. So this project is called The Racial Frontier, Biracials, Machine Learning, and the Future of Racial Group Boundaries. So the motivation for this talk is that it's become increasingly popular in social science over the last 10 years or so to try and compare biracial subgroups, so people like Black white biracials, Latino white biracials, to their single race counterparts, people like single race whites, single race Blacks, in order to make inferences about the racial hierarchy and racial group boundaries. To kind of highlight what's at stake here, why people would want to do this, Richard Alba wrote a really good book in 2020, which highlights this infamous prediction that America by the year 2045 is going to be for the first time majority minority. So this prediction was based off demographic studies done by Daniel Frey, which uses census data on immigration, birth, and especially relies on differential rates of intermarriage rates and growing rates of intermarriage. So this prediction has galvanized commentary on a host of topics like white backlash, the idea that whites are going to be frustrated with real or perceived threats to their hegemony and population size. And it's also led people to question whether this higher number of minorities necessarily means more support for egalitarian policies and for the Democratic Party. However, there's a problem with this prediction mathematically. So this majority-minority prediction takes as a given, it assumes within its framework that all individuals born to one white parent and to one minority parent will both identify singularly with their minority heritage and group, and also maintain the political loyalties and characteristics of that minority group. Okay, so this is a long-standing tradition in the United States. This is what we refer to as hypodescent, also known as the one-drop rule, which can be defined as a social and institutional norm, which decrees that any individual with one drop of Black blood or ancestry is considered de facto Black. Now, why this kind of started with Blacks during slavery, with whites trying to protect what they can designate as property by expanding the boundaries or by closing off the boundaries to what it is to be white. This has since then evolved to also apply to any non-Black minority group. So if you're Asian and white or Latino and white, they expect you to don the characteristics and the identities of your minority racial group, right? The problem with this is, as prominent as it is, a lot of what I study is whether or not this actually holds true, both in people's identity choices, in their income and their socio-demographic characteristics, and especially in their politics. So like I said, this has become kind of an increasingly popular topic in the past 10 years or so. So scholars across disciplines compare biracials to their higher and lower status groups, not in my heart, but in the way that we think of the racial hierarchy, with whites on top, followed by Asians, and then Latinos and Blacks. People try to compare biracials to both of their counterpart racial groups. They do this in sociology. They look at identity choice and external categorizations of biracials. They find interesting things like Black, white biracials. They graphically morph people's faces to have equal characteristics of Black phenotype and skin color and white phenotype and skin color, and they show that they're almost always categorized as Black. But if you have Asian and whites and you mix their phenotypes, there's a real mix-up in how they identify people. So they do the same with income and education. They want to see if Black whites and Asian whites are more similar in their education and income to whites or to their minority group, and so forth with poverty and inequality, and especially in mental and physical health. And recently, this has become an important topic in political science. A couple of folks have tried to examine whether biracials are more similar to their higher or lower status groups in their political attitudes. But it's a really new field, and there's not a ton of work on this. So I've been excited to try to contribute to this. So this current study, what it mainly does is it presents a new machine learning framework for comparing biracials to their single race counterparts. And the benefit of this is I'm able to use the total picture of data to make very comprehensive and very generalized estimates to answer the question very broadly: are the politics of biracials more similar to their minority counterpart or to whites, or to whatever their counterpart groups are? So this framework can actually be applied to any groups. I think you could probably use it to compare people who are independent to people who are Democrat and Republican, any kind of intermediary group you could use it for, but it's going to be applied here to biracials' political characteristics. I also like to talk about this data. We collected this data in 2020, and I'll talk a little bit about how difficult that was to do, because it's very difficult to sample biracials. So this survey sampled 140,000 people and walked away with samples as low as 114 people in some cells for Latino Asians, these really hard to reach populations. And that data is now public, so I encourage folks to use that. And the other thing I do is people have assessed hypodescent in a lot of different ways, looking at like their socio-demographic characteristics and their identity choices. But for some reason, people they use this data, these findings, to make inferences about how racial boundaries will look in the future. But people still haven't tried to add any kind of over time dimension or see if patterns of hypodescent are changing as each generation comes. The last thing I want to say is machine learning has a horrible history with race. And so it's important to clarify that this is not meant to try to impart like an essentialist definition of race. We're not measuring racial categorization or affronting race in the real world. Just make sure that that's clear. Okay, so this is a graphical interpretation of the task at hand. So you have these three continua, and if you can imagine if you were trying to compare biracials to their single race groups in order to make inferences about the hierarchy, the first thing you do is you think of what kind of variable makes sense to characterize these three straight line continua, right? So this might work fairly well. A logical choice could be to use income, where you would take the mean income of whites and you put it on the top endpoint, and the mean income of blacks and you put it on the bottom. And then you would take the mean income of black whites, and if it's more near one or the other racial group, we would deduce that if they're adhering to hypodescent in their expression of this characteristic, right? So this works fairly well if you have single and objective outcomes, measurable outcomes like income, but it gets quite complicated when you want to use subjective outcomes like political attitudes. For example, you have to make decisions a priori about what outcomes you're going to use to compare biracials to the single race people. And it gets especially difficult if you want to average across a number of different outcomes. So I spent a lot of time trying to see how biracials stack up on these different outcomes, and they vary. Sometimes they're closer to white, sometimes they're closer to the minority group. So it gets difficult to do that. So these are some of the struggles. So another kind of example of what the traditional models do, so it's clear what it is we're trying to improve upon here. Let's use income as an example, like we've been doing. Here's a simple regression model where you have two dummy variables for each single race counterpart group. And in these models, the excluded category are each biracial subgroup. So black-white biracials in the first model, Latino-white biracials in the second model, and Asian-white biracials in the third model. So here, beta 0 is the intercept. It represents biracials' mean income. Beta 0 plus 1 is the minority group's income, and beta 0 plus 2 is white's income. The inference that we make is if the absolute value of beta 1, so the distance from biracial's income to black's income, is smaller than the distance between biracial's income and white's income, then we assume that hypodescent has been applied or adhered to in this mathematical framework. All right. So like I said, this is straightforward for single and objective outcomes, but there are some issues when it comes to generalizability and selection of the dependent variables, especially for subjective measures like political attitudes. We talked about this a little bit already, but to give it more color, in terms of outcome selection, with these kinds of traditional models, you have to make assumptions a priori regarding which outcomes best characterize the difference between racial groups or between whites and each minority group. A logical place to start could be with partisanship, but we know that partisanship will tell us a whole lot more about what makes blacks different from whites than it will about what makes Latinos different from whites or what makes Asians different from whites, right? The other problem here is people often use single racial attitudes to compare their racial groups. So they'll look at black whites on affirmative action and Latino whites on immigration or something like that. But when you do this, you can't necessarily compare across different biracial subgroups because you're using completely different outcomes. So it's hard to tell which of these attitudes are more central to any racial group and then compare those across groups. So it's kind of difficult to do that. And then I think the hardest part is, again, it's tough or near impossible to generalize across several different outcomes at a time. You might consider, let's take 100 different political outcomes and let's see, let's count the number of times biracials are more similar to blacks or more similar to whites. But obviously outcomes are not weighted equally. If you do that, you're going to have some attitudes that matter more and some that matter less. And again, if you get differences across, the other problem with that too is they flip. Biracials are very often more similar to their higher status group and lower status group. It gets really messy really quick. I've tried dozens of times. I have really horrible plots with 400 things plotted at the end of this paper if you want to bore yourself. Okay. So the other problem with these earlier studies, and this I think has been a significant mathematical problem, that I hope to kind of unearth here is that typical studies identify their biracial samples according to self-identification rather than parentage. And this is highly problematic for a number of reasons. One, self-identification is supremely unstable. We have seen some studies that show that if you are a biracial person, someone with a Black parent and white mother, or any type of interracial mix, you can actually be more likely to change the way that you identify yourself personally on a survey like the census, I think specifically the census, than you are to keep it the same. This changes across time, this changes across context, and this is the focus of my main research agenda, is examining how context and different things affect kind of the social category of race that people adopt and the way that influences their group thinking and their approach and perceptions of politics and that kind of thing. So this is a big problem. If you're resampling the same population and you're getting different people in your sample, that's a generalizability issue. And we don't know if we can extrapolate what we see in one sample to another a year from now, 5 years from now, or even in a different state. So this is another way to say the main problem with these studies is self-identification is endogenous to political outcomes. So if your sample consists of people who have identified as Black, white on a survey, you're not going to know much about how biracials are similar or not to Blacks, because everyone who has strong Black opinions are going to select out of their sample by identifying singularly as white. And this is a common thing. So that's an issue that we're hoping to get across. The reason that this is an issue, and I think a fair point, is the census and so many people use self-identification as a means of identifying. And in terms of personal identification, self-identity is paramount. But in terms of trying to understand the phenomenon underneath these groups, the hypodescent, which regards parentage, ancestry, and heritage, you need to look at the parents' races, which is so often on these surveys. So that was the point of trying to get these surveys done. In 2020, Nationscape at UCLA did a really large survey. It might have been the biggest ever. I think it has 500,000 people or something. They sampled thousands and thousands of people every week from the beginning of 2019 to early 2021. And luckily, I was able to put on my module, which asked people questions about the race of themselves and the race of their parents, that was on the survey for 21 different weeks and yielded to a total of 124,204 people. And another good thing about the survey is it has 97 different politically relevant features. And again, the goal of this machine learning tactic is I'm going to try to use the total picture of data to answer as broadly as possible how biracial politics compared to single race people. So this means we're incorporating candidate evaluations, economic attitudes, racial attitudes, social attitudes, policy preferences, participatory behaviors, protesting, voting, all that kind of thing. And so again, here I measure race in two different ways. So I measure race for each respondent and their parents. We'll talk about race in two different ways, biracialism. One is by ancestry, and ancestry is coded in terms of what people report about their parents' races. So if you are Black and white by ancestry, that means you have one parent who is Black and nothing else, and one parent who is white and nothing else. And same for Latino whites, Asian whites, and so on. And then I'll also talk about biracialism in self-identification. And that would be somebody who, regardless of what their parents' races are, self-identified with two and only two groups. Okay, so I'd like to show the sample size so you can get a sense for how difficult it is to sample some of these groups and why it was so, I think, important to sample 125,000 people to get these. Because you're not just talking about the 10% of the population that identifies as biracial, you're talking about pockets within that are sometimes much, much smaller. So even with 124,000 people sampled, we have 93 Black Asians and so forth. But I promise you, these are very robust samples in terms of this kind of work. So we are grateful for that. All right, so I used the method called ensemble machine learning classification. I'm just going to give a brief overview of that. So machine learning classification, what it does is it essentially makes predictions using data, like most linear models. But its goal is to do well in out-of-sample predictions, so predicting on new data. It essentially takes a set of known outcomes, or Ys, which in this case is going to be racial group ancestry. We're predicting people's parents' races. And then it takes a set of input features, or what we know as covariates or independent variables, to estimate some function we're going to call g hat. So g hat uses these nonlinear and flexible methods to take these feature set independent variables x's and build a model that will best predict or maximally predict these y outcomes, right? So in this case, x is going to be the 97 different political characteristics, which is our feature set. Machine learning is helpful because it more accurately predicts y than traditional models like ordinary least squares or logit, especially under conditions like I suspect this one is, which is high dimensionality, having tons of covariates, and probably a complex functional form. So a complex relationship among those features to predict whatever outcome we're looking at. So the word ensemble just means that we're going to use multiple different candidate or single machine learning algorithms to overall boost the accuracy and robustness. We're going to, in some ways, average across the predictions of multiple models based on how accurately those models performed at predicting in out-of-sample tests. This is a long way to say we're just going to use some x's to build a model that will predict some y's, just like most things. And just for this model, I use logit, lasso, random forest, kernel support vector machines, neural networks, extreme gradient boosting, and bagging. All right, so this is the crux of the innovation of the study, my estimation strategy. This is why this paper is super weird, but hopefully interesting. So we're going to predict the race of people's parents. Okay, and so we're going to create 6 different models corresponding to each different biracial subgroup: black whites, Latino whites, Asian whites, black Latinos, black Asians, and Latino Asians. Stated specifically in the inverse order of hypodescent for a reason. Just to help organize the way that this paper works. So whys in this case, but I'm just going to talk about black whites, Latino whites, and Asian whites, because keeping white as a common counterpart in this makes it easier to understand, I think, for this part. So for these models, y of 1 is going to be somebody who has 2 white parents, and a y of 0 is going to be somebody who has 2 minority parents. Okay, and x again is the feature set, and g is the learned machine learning function. So the first step in this is I train several separate machine learning models to make binary classifications among single race ancestry pairs. And then I assess model accuracy. So what that means is first I build a model called g hat b plus w, which uses all of the data on the feature set characteristics of people who are single race black and people who are single race white, and equal numbers of those two, so the model doesn't get biased towards over predicting one or the other, and they have an equal chance of being predicted. And then I tell this model, using data on just blacks and just whites, tell me who is black and who is white. And then I assess how that works in out-of-sample tests. And then next I do the same with g hat l plus w to measure. So I include data on just Latinos and just whites, and I tell it, learn to tell me who's Latino and who's white. I do the same for Asians and whites. I do the same for blacks and Latinos. And I do the same for blacks and Asians, and then Latinos and Asians. Then the next and the main the main trick here is, rather than test these models after I've already tested them on single race people, I then swap in the feature sets with single race data, and I include biracials data only. So I take the model g hat p plus w, which is trained to tell me whether somebody is black or whether somebody is white, and I throw into it the data only from people who have 1 black and 1 white parent. And so for each observation, it assigns a probability that observation should be classified as either single race white or single race black. It's 1 probability of being 1 or 0. And I do the same for Latino whites and Asian whites, where I apply the model that tells me whether someone's Latino or white, and I feed it just people who are Latino whites, and so forth. And the final quantity of interest here, I calculate the mean probability of classification of white in each model. So we have this earlier problem, which is solved now by using the classification prediction means as essentially where biracials stack up on these straight line continua. So if you have a score of 50%, 50% of the group, it's not so much that 50% of the group was categorized as white, it's just that the average probability of classification as white is 50%. If you have higher than that, if the average prediction for the group is more likely to be white than it is to be black, we would assume that their characteristics are overall more similar to their higher status category than their lower status group, right? And so this is, so anything below 0.5 in the mean is going to indicate adherence to hypodescent as a way of saying this biracial subgroup is overall more similar to the minority category than it is their higher status category. Okay. So since this is a study on hypodescent, I cannot do it, and it wouldn't even be a study on hypodescent if without a bunch of qualifying, if I didn't look at identity choice. So the first thing you want to do, and again, since we have this data, is we're going to look at how people within each ancestral category identify themselves. All right, so we'll look at our 6 subgroups: black, whites, Latino whites, and you know this by now. So within each subgroup, we're going to calculate the proportion who racially self-identify in 3 different ways. One, people who self-identify singularly with only their higher status group. So black, whites who identify only, people with 1 black parent and 1 white parent who identify only as white. Then 2, we're going to look at people who identify with their lower status group. This is black, white, biracials who identify only as black. And then 3, people who are biracial who identify with both groups simultaneously or biracially, which is black, whites who identify as just black and white and not a third or any more categories. Okay. But what we're going to do here that is different from some of the things that have been done in the past is we now have the data to split up into 4 different generational categories. So we're going to have one group that's Gen Z, 26 and younger at the time of the survey, all the way up to baby boomers who are 59 to 77 at the time of the survey. And we're going to see if we can see any patterns. And lo and behold, we do. So the first pattern I'd like to draw your attention to is the darkest shading on the top, which represents biracials who've identified singularly with their lower status category or their minority racial group, right? So in terms of baby boomers, you see that the majority of them in most categories, well, half the categories, people who have mixed race parents or interracial parents identify singularly with their minority group. But by the time you get to Generation Z, there is no group in which half or more people identify singularly with their minority category. So this is a way of saying across each generation, people are less likely to adhere to this heuristic hypodescent that we have taken as a given and assume that it is the way that champions and governs categorization, both external and the way people see themselves in terms of their identity and their belonging, right? So that alone is kind of interesting. The other thing that we don't see, though, is we don't see a corollary pattern here where there's an increase in the proportion of people who identify with their higher status group. So if you look at the lightest shading, which indicates identification singularly with your higher status group, so be it whites or whatever other group, we don't see that group is getting bigger. What we're seeing is most people are now flexibly able to identify with both of their different categories, which theoretically, presumably, that means they're donning some characteristics of either, right? And maybe these can come out in different contexts or when one race is more salient than the other. But that is the case there. The implication to this that I think is so important is a lot of times in political science and elsewhere, people use identity choice as a signal for what people's allegiances are and their politics and all their characteristics and stuff. This is kind of the idea behind using self-identity as the way to enumerate or identify biracials in the first place and why that's a bad idea. So what we're going to do later is in a couple of minutes, we're going to look at whether people who identify as single race people are actually similar to people who have 2 parents from that race. So theoretically, it should signal loyalty and kind of donning that social category. But in fact, it super doesn't. I mean, it kind of does, not really. We'll get there. Okay, so this is, in terms of the machine learning models I talked about creating, those 6 different models, this is just the outcome of that, like the assessing of that. So you take 80% of your sample of data and you train your models to do what they're told to do. And then you take this randomly withheld 20% of it and you test your models to see how well it performs. So there's not really a tradition or a benchmark for this, but I think people usually say 70% prediction is good, 90% prediction is amazing. So we're about in between. The average prediction success rate on the top, you can see the accuracy is 79% across each thing. The other important thing here is that precision and recall are really similar to each other. So precision is going to be the amount of higher status categories observations that we correctly identify as higher status categories. And recall is going to be the proportion of lower status categories that we correctly identify as lower status categories. The problem there is if those were very different, I'd say like more than 0.1 different from each other, we would know that our models are over predicting one group compared to the other. And so that wouldn't give each racial group an equal chance to get predicted. And that would be bad. The other interesting thing here, and I haven't really been able to make much of this, but I do find it interesting, is I sometimes think you might use the accuracy with which racial groups are distinguished from each other in machine learning models as like a barometer or an empirical measurement of the distancing between groups in society. So by this, I mean, if you think of the hierarchy in terms of like a spatial continuum, where again, you have whites at place 1, Asians at place 2, Latinos at place 3, and blacks at place 4. Theoretically or hypothetically, groups who are farther away from each other, more distance in society and on this continua, should be more easy to tell apart because they have more different political characteristics. And people who are closer together should be more difficult to distinguish because they're theoretically less distant from one another. And that is actually what we find. So among each group that sits directly next to one another on this theoretical continuum, they have the lowest categories of success in terms of predicting who's different. So Asian and whites are notoriously well assimilated in terms of literature. Asians are quickly, I forgot to mention this other stake here, is kind of an important point. Right now, for US-born Latinos and US-born Asians, a majority of them outmarry with whites rather than from Asians or Latinos, whatever the minority group is. So if you think of this indefinite intermarriage or mixing between these two racial groups, and you don't have sufficient immigration kind of replenishing these populations of Latinos and Asians, 100, 200, 300 years, that matter, however these children decide to identify and behave matters a lot for whether these groups continue to exist. And not just that, but the rate at which they mix, I think, can tell you a lot about the social distancing between groups, right? Because if blacks and whites are intermarrying at, I think, 18%, and Latinos and Asians are marrying at 70 and 60%, something like that, you can see that there's still more social distance. It's like I always try to empirically measure this social distance, but sometimes it's a losing game. All right, so people who are black and white and Latino and white, those who are farther away on this theoretical line are easier to distinguish from one another, because theoretically they should have more different politics. Okay, so this is the result of the test that I've been talking about this whole time. And so what it does is, this is how biracials, this is the mean probabilities that each biracial will be categorized with their higher status category. And I've organized this weird, I gotta fix this. But higher categorization in the top 3 plots means not adhering to hypodescent, but on the bottom 3 plots, higher categorization, higher probabilities means correct, yes, adhering to hypodescent. I'll try to explain right now. All right. So we actually see what we expect to see for blacks, which is that blackness continues to be the heaviest or weightiest or has the most gravity in terms of a racial group, because most black categories that are part black are more likely to be classified as black than they are to be white. But interestingly, it's pretty damn close. It's not, these aren't extreme values here, right? So I think, and this is something I see a lot, black whites, black Asians, they have a not as high propensity to have pro-black opinions as you might think. Again, the subject of other research. What we do see though is among Latino whites and Asian whites, especially or Asian whites, they're actually more likely to be classified as white than they are minority. So this again flies in the face of this minority majority prediction, which is that they're going to be loyal to the minority party. They're very much not. They are more likely to be classified as white. And I'm going to get to more stuff. Okay, so the next thing we want to do, I talked a little bit about how identity choice is theorized to be a signal for the political characteristics and the socio-demographic characteristics and all these things that are race related for biracials, right? So what we're going to do is assess this. We're now going to split up these biracial ancestry categories into 3 different groups each, again, according to the identity choice, using the same paradigm of do they identify with their higher status category only, lower status only, or with both. And we're going to take these and we're going to throw them at the machine learning model and see if identity choice has any bearing on whether they're more likely or less likely to be categorized with their groups, one or the other. And this to me is fascinating because you see almost a perfectly linear relationship between how people identify and whether they are more or less likely to be categorized with one group or the other. All right, so that is to say, on this top left plot, we have on this first line is black whites who've identified as white, and we see that they are the most likely to be classified as white than anyone else, right? So in some ways, identity choice is signaling people's political characteristics, right? The only one this doesn't work for is Latino Asians. Yeah, no. There's some small sample group. I forget which one it is though. And you see over here that Asian whites and Latino whites, people who identify as white, they are somewhat more likely to be identified as white. But the other thing I think is interesting here is these differences really only seem to be meaningful within this ancestral subgroup. That is to say, if you were to throw in people who are single race white into each of these models, they would be being predicted 80% likely to be classified as white, right? Because we have an 80% accuracy rate. So if these are nowhere near 80%, that's another way of saying, though these people identify with one group, their characteristics are still very much different from the characteristics of people who have two same race parents who might be white. And the inference from this is that perhaps a lot of the identification biracials are doing should be considered prospective instead of actual. So a lot of what they're doing is identifying ahead of time with the group they want to be a part of, but they're getting these forces of elimination or these forces of exclusion, though they might psychologically see themselves as white or want to be. Whites are saying, no, you can't be part of this group. So I think that might be a lot of what's going on. So variation, but linear variation, but only meaningful within each category. Okay, and so the final test that I do is what we're going to do is we're going to split the single race ancestry. We're going to split all the data that we have into our original 4 separate generational cohorts. So we're going to now train 24 new models, ensemble models, to predict single race ancestry. So we're doing the same thing we did that I discussed, the new machine learning model regarding. But we're going to break it up into generational cohorts. So we're going to take all the single race black and white baby boomers, and we're going to train a model telling us among those baby boomers who is black and who is white. And then we're going to feed into that model only people who are baby boomers who have a black parent and a white parent. And we're going to do the same for Generation X, Generation Millennials, and Generation Z. So we're going to do 24 different models and see if we see a pattern over the course of time. And we super see a pattern over each generation, right? So pretty fascinatingly, across each generation, as generations get younger, the problem with here, I probably should have clarified, is I'm sure you're well aware of this, but you can't exactly infer that time is the thing here. It could be a generational or cohort effect. So it could just be that when you're older, you've experienced more discrimination, and so you're more likely to see yourself as black now. When you're younger, you have not made decisions about what your identity choice is. But it could be, I like to think of this through a symbolic politics or socialization, impressionable-years hypothesis type thing, where a lot of people's politics, and especially their racial affect, their feelings about race, crystallized around the time of 2025 before 30. So if you think of it like that, if you leverage that theory and you believe in that, then what we should be seeing is like decaying effects from the way that the racial hierarchy was organized around the time these people were all 20, 25, 30. Okay, so if you think of it like that, you could make some argument, it's a bad argument, but it's some argument for this being an over time effect and a measurement of these overarching social institutional contours or constraints that represent hypodescent, these forces that teach people what racial group they are, even though they have two parents from different racial groups, right? Okay, most importantly, over time, every single subgroup except for Black Latinos, is getting more and more likely to be classified with their higher status category, flying in the face of these assumptions of hypodescent or minority sameness than they are to be categorized with their minority identity. This is even true for Black whites. Black white Gen Zers are more likely to be classified as white. They're more similar to white Gen Zers than they are to Blacks. And it's super the case for Latino whites, Asian whites, who are two-thirds likely to be classified as their higher category. So you could make the inference here that over time, the contours of the constraints to hypodescent in terms of their power to predict people's stations or categories is relaxing a little bit, perhaps. I don't know. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Well, we are going to have Greg monitor his own questions. So if there are questions, you can always start in the room, and then Macy will be helping us with monitoring the questions that come through online. So any questions in the room at this time? I can start with one.
It's kind of a weird project, huh?
It's a really interesting project, actually. I wanted to ask you a question about analysis C, and kind of thinking about how analysis C and D kind of fit together in the argument that you're making.
Yeah.
I was wondering about whether or not that performative aspirational component you were kind of talking about, which is really fascinating to me, that people are kind of, I used to say faking it till they make it, but that's essentially what you're kind of saying, right? Would you think that that is also something that would carry through the generations as well, right?
Oh,
To
interesting.
think about what you were talking about in terms of obviously the barriers for, I don't want to say Gen X, but certainly the boomers were very, very different from Gen Z.
Totally, yeah.
Right.
I think that that is going to depend on which biracial subgroup you're coming from, and then your gender. So what we know from the literature is people who are Black and white are, Black again being like the weightiest racial group or having the most gravity. It's more forceful in contouring your characteristics and your identity choices, right? So I think I would say Black whites have less permeability to kind of transgress racial group boundaries than do Latino whites or Asian whites, those two categories, right? So I think in that sense, Black whites are not gonna be prospective too much, but the other part I think is there's a difference between men and women in how they're treated and the kind of rates of discrimination they experience and the types of discrimination they experience. And people have theorized a lot in sociology, Jennifer Sims, that this leads to Black white women having a higher likelihood of donning the characteristics of whites than Black white men. And the reason for this is theorized to be Black men experience much more discrimination that inculcates or ascribes to you a racial identity, reminds you you're Black, and teaches you that those boundaries are not permeable. Whereas Black white women do not experience those kinds of as frequently as do Black men. So I think it depends. Gender, I think, is the answer there, and the racial category. Great question, though.
Yeah, I have more of it. Go ahead, Anna.
I really enjoyed this. I think it's a great, and there's a lot here. So,
Yeah.
like too much to, I mean, I think I have very specific questions about some of these different analyses, but, I'm gonna ask, I'm not gonna do that because I need to.
You can send them to me. I'd love to answer them.
Yeah.
Though. I gotta get back to this one, and it used to be a research note, so now it has to be. I have to fix it, and I need help. So thank you.
Yeah. So this is more like a theoretical question.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it seems like one of your arguments, I mean, you're looking at or trying to capture change in our racial hierarchy order, however you want to think about it. But in predicting whether these biracial respondents are either going to identify as their white ancestry or their minoritized group, it's kind of a static, it's assuming not change in the racial hierarchy, right? So they still have the same choices. They're either gonna go with the white or the higher status group or the lower status group. So I'm wondering, I mean, did you think about another option, which is, you know, identify as a multiracial person or something that kind of builds a new option?
Yeah.
Predicting how these people place themselves.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. I mean, I think I see what you mean. Let me give it a shot.
Yeah.
So one, I think that is the impetus for trying to estimate over time, because these things are static. The way that anyone identifies and trying to leverage this over time dimension. In terms of the mixed race category, there are a number of studies and frustratingly a number of states who allow you to identify as mixed race. Let's tell a terrible story about Newt Gingrich in the 1990s. Okay. In North Carolina and Florida, there is this option when you register to vote, you know, that the southern states have to put race on there so they can monitor to make sure Black people are registering to vote and turning out and stuff. These white mothers of mixed race children at school boards around the country started fighting to get this category called multiracial or mixed race so that their children can affront the identity that they want to identify with, right? And so who champions this progressive thing for all people's personal identities is the Republicans, Newt Gingrich. But they don't want you to be able to select both Black and white or Latino and white. What they want specifically is a multiracial category. Because what is that going to do? It's going to take away from the amount of people who identify as Black, the amount of people who identify as Latino, and screw up the kind of appropriations, federal money appropriations and things that are going to go to these groups. I'm doing a study now that shows people who do not have a mixed race category in Florida, North Carolina are more likely to identify as Black than they are white, right? So what we're doing is we're effectively artificially decreasing the amount of people the amount of Blacks we think are voting. So that is to say, the mixed category, the other thing about this is, I do not believe the mixed category is particularly viable. So it's an amorphous category. It does not seem to have discrete bounds, as in the people who identify as mixed don't have any near similar category. You can run like a PCA on this, and there's nothing that brings these groups together. The other thing is, I think that being biracial is a story of trying to get belonging. Most of my work shows that if you're biracial and you live in a space with one group, you work really hard to be a member of that group. If you're biracial, black, white, and you live in a black neighborhood, you are more pro-Obama than anybody who's in the world, right? And if you're living in a super white neighborhood, I have models that show that they can be as supportive of the KKK as are whites if they live in a completely densely segregated white neighborhood, right? So I really think that being biracial is a story of trying to find belonging in different groups. And as far as an idea that like a multiracial superordinate category that people are going to eschew their biracial, their single race categories for, I don't believe that to be viable. So I guess, but I think some people are interested in that, and it could be a thing. Some people, a very small proportion of biracials discard both their identities. They've experienced so much bullshit from each racial group that they're like, I'm going to identify with no race now. You know what I mean? So I think you could see some of that, but I see this as a game of, as time goes on, you see some groups reallocate with other groups and not create new ones. I don't think. Because black whites and Asian whites and Latino whites, the people who might unite and become this multiracial group someday, I think they're very different, and I don't see them banding together and creating, I don't know. But there's a small portion of people who do, but it's a small population. Does that answer your question? I think I probably missed some though.
That's a good answer.
Okay, great question. Hey.
Hey, Jonathan, I appreciate your bookkeeping and keeping everything all nice and orderly with the notation and syntax. So good job.
Oh, great, thank you.
And I thought about this in terms of, the idea about geography and where someone was raised and how that might influence one's view on things. In the same kind of way, are there people or scholars looking at maybe the heritage of the mother, not just black, white, but if your mother was white versus your father being white, in a mixed race situation, or biracial situation. And then also, can you go back to analysis A?
Yeah.
So I feel like that kind of what you're saying in terms of, like there's like the white, the black, or the two extremes, and then also there's that middle in segmented bar graph too. And can you also talk about like I guess I have my own personal experience and so forth, and that maybe my generation, Gen X, let's say, has had more access to white culture, white ideology, white privilege, if you will, than my grandparents, for example, than my parents. And my children, even more than me. And so that's kind of contributed to this idea that as time goes on, these different groups are kind of, I guess, embracing white culture. But can you talk a little bit about one area that I'm not familiar with as far as Latino, Asians, that combination, because it's not as prevalent. Maybe in California, perhaps.
One of the issues with this is that's the smallest cell I was talking about. There are 4 boomer Latino Asians. So we don't have much, those are super insignificant. I can try to talk about that a little bit. To the first question, I think that's a great question, great intuition. It does matter a great deal, not a great deal, a good deal, what the gender race combinations of people's parents are. And I've looked a lot at the transmission of political values from parent to child using voter files and like grouping them by homes. In like North Carolina and Florida, where you can identify a family that has 2 white people within the same 10 years of age, and who are mixed gender and who have a 3rd oldest voter who's 17 years younger than the 2nd oldest voter, these family structures, and you can assess how if you have a black mom and a white dad versus a white mom and a black dad, how that affects your partisanship, how that affects the transmission of stuff. And so it varies from subgroup to subgroup. If you are black and white, whatever race the mother is matters a lot more for your politics than does your father's politics. So you're more likely to inherit a Democratic identity from regardless of what race it is. So it tends to be a gendered over race issue, I think, within the home. You see the opposite for Latino whites, in that the father's partisanship matters a ton, and not so much the father's race. You know what I mean? So I think a lot of it, this is like a common experience with black, white people, right? You have the mothers who are experiencing discrimination for the first time through the lens of their children. And so they are all up underneath the children at their schools and trying to make sure that everything's going well. So I think there's close relationships there. My answer to that would be that the gender of the parents is dominant in that situation. The next, hopefully that's sufficient. The next question is, Latino Asians. There is not any work on this. There's really not a lot of, there's one chapter in a book on this that I read about Latino Asians, Black Latinos, and Black Asians, which I would call dual minority biracial. I could say the only thing I've seen in my analysis is that when you have Asian and white people, this interesting thing happens where since you have these two racial groups who are theoretically at the top of this hierarchy, they have the highest education rates, the highest income, those kinds of things. You don't see the biracial subgroup in terms of socioeconomics having an intermediary position. You actually see them dovetailing and ending up having a higher status in their income and education than do single race Latinos and single race whites. You know what I mean? And so this is to say that in terms of dual minorities, you see the opposite effect where people who are Black and Latino combine their characteristics and networks or whatever to dovetail and have worse characteristics than either single race Blacks or either single race whites. So that's what I think is the most interesting phenomenon with that is there's like they're on the extremes of this hierarchy in terms of their predicted health, their like rates of heart attacks, those kinds of things, income, education. And I perceive a lot of this is because you are both these racial groups, and between Blacks and Latinos, there's a lot of animosity in the first place, this interracial hostility, right? So not only are you a minority in two different ways, being excluded from these groups, but you don't necessarily also get some of the benefits of like, especially Latino identity, which is like living in the barrio and having people look after each other. You don't get this group identity that benefits and that makes up for a lot of the discrimination's effects on health, which is having this community of people who protect each other. You know what I mean? So I think you're doubly bound and then also don't get the benefits of being part of a minority group because you get some means of exclusion. So I think that's a pretty tough tale. These are the people, Latino Asians, like my sister's husband is Latino Asian, and they just had a child. So he is all for racial groups, which is quite interesting. But he has never voted. He does not care about race. He does not care about politics. And I think it's a common thing because, you know, where do they go racially? They have to kind of have this I think you develop a sense of self-preservation, and that trumps this group connectedness in those cases. So those are really extreme cases. They're very rare, but they do offer a lot of interesting things like that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So this question is
Can you speak up just a little?
This question is asking if you can talk more about the correlation with gender, but the generational piece.
Oh, interesting. You know, I don't think that I know much more. I could talk about the things I know with gender. I don't know that I've ever looked at something over time, but what I was talking about is this research by Jennifer Sims, who's a sociologist, amazing scholar in Alabama, Huntsville, and she does qualitative research and she looks at people who are doing online dating, and she does other kind of qualitative interview stuff, right? And she reads she like does experiments where she sends a fake profile who's mixed Black white, she sends a fake profile who's mixed Black Asian, and she does this for men and women, right? And then she also does other stuff, looks at discrimination rates and qualitative data. What she finds and what other people have found is that Black men are more likely to be pulled over by the police. They're more likely to experience kind of the traditional forms of racial discrimination that you might think, right? Like not getting service at a restaurant or whatever the hell it's going to be, mostly police stuff. And so these kinds of experience have the effect of inculcating or like strongly ascribing, like I said, that their Black identity. But for Black women, their most salient form of discrimination, Black white women, comes from not interracial, I guess necessarily, comes from contact with single race Black women in this competition for the marriage market, right? Because Black white women get a lot of crap they get excluded because theoretically there's competition and these Black white women are considered beautiful for having these Eurocentric features and these like straighter hair and that kind of shit. So that leads them, since whereas Black white men experience a camaraderie with Black men because they experience similar types of discrimination, Black white women get excluded from their counterpart gender group, and that drives them to be a little bit more likely to be white, to use their whiteness as cachet in a social dating platform to text somebody saying, I don't care about BLM, just so you know. You know what I mean? So to kind of like make some inroads with whites in order to whatever, because they've been excluded from Black women, so they're more likely to go to whatever other group is there with their arms held out to help them. That's what I know about that. A lot more work needs to be done on that. The other thing is, people who are women are more likely to identify with two racial groups than one. They have an easier time grasping the concept of two racial groups being able to simultaneously exist at the same time and being a member of both groups. Why that is, probably for some of the reasons I just talked about, but yeah.
I have two finger on that, just to follow up, surprise, I'm gonna say, I think there's more gender here that you could probably look at.
Totally, yeah.
But I was also thinking about the out marriage component with regard to how it might shape some of these generational components, and thinking specifically about Gen X and younger. And I don't know, because I haven't looked at the sociology literature on this lately, but the out marriage rates for like API women is something like astronomical.
Yeah, totally.
So the gender difference within the API community is huge.
That's
right?
totally true, yeah.
As opposed to it being closer for Blacks and being much closer for Latinx folks. And so I was wondering about whether or not you would think in some of these biracial pairings, depending on how they're identifying, whether or not some of those gender outcomes might also, like, would they be more influential in those pairings?
Totally,
as opposed
yeah.
to others?
I haven't looked at that. That's a really good question. And that could be like an insidious confounder to all the things that I do every day. And
Cool.
that's an awesome question. So
Rely on me to call that out.
yeah, no, I appreciate it. So I guess I would think about it like this. I just saw something in the news where ideologically, partisanship, I think ideology, men and women are diverging like crazy across a lot of countries, right?
Very true.
And the other thing we know is that gender totally plays a role in the probability of an interracial relationship, right? So if you're Black men and white women account for, I think, 80% of all Black-white relationships.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so you see similar thing with whites and Asian women. Asian women are not as likely, Asian women likely marry whites, but Asian men are not as likely to outmarry whites. So thinking that there's different probabilities of these groups interacting, and you have different baselines for what these genders within these groups are thinking in terms of their ideology, that probably feeds into some of these differences that you see, right?
Yeah.
So if Black men are more conservative, theoretically, you might think that Black-white children, by virtue of having 80% Black fathers, are going to be more conservative. And that might be driving some of this effect of being more likely to be categorized as white. That's totally possible. That's a seriously dope question.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I got to think about that. Yep.
So this person says, thank you so much for this. As a biracial white father, Black mother, this has been so informative and made things click for me. I
That's so
have
sweet.
self-identified as white, and I have grown in a society which told me to do so. Now that I have children, their father is Arab white, and we both are incredibly surprised with how fair complected they are. Filling out forms has been tricky. How do we approach this without discrediting and addressing who we are as parents?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. First, I would say there's a ton of cool stuff to read on this subject. If you want to email me, I'm happy to reach out. Also, too, since I now know there's a biracial, I mean, you could always take like a survey, but not a big deal. Talk about that later. I mean, I think that you need to be honest. Beyond measuring how heritage works, I think we need to put supreme importance on people's self-identities on however they feel. So I do not think you can go wrong with expressing whatever racial groups you feel to be a part of most. I think that you should identify with both. Do what I used to do and my cousins used to do before they allowed us to mark two anyways, or write whatever you want to write. You know what I mean? And over time, if you have a way you feel about the identity choice, as you express that more and more, that's the only way that those identities could ever be accepted in the future anyways. So I would say identify however the hell you want to identify and screw everything else.
Did your study consider beauty aesthetics, specifically proximity to whiteness, and how mixed race people, specifically women, are perceived and or how they identify?
No, I didn't, but I super wish I did. So the other thing that I write about a lot, only to say that I can't really assess this with the data at hand, but I think visual appearance is playing a really strong role in contouring people's chances of having access to any racial group identity or reminding them that they're part of some group, right? And I think a lot of this is beauty, and I think a lot of this is skin color. There was one study, one data set that I looked at many years ago that asked people whether they think it's this question called street race. When you walk down the street, do people perceive you as white, black, or multiracial? Were the three options that you got. And I find that people who are, and I found this with other data with skin color too. Oh yeah, the CMPS has this, and I looked at this. Okay, so here we have my colleague Yaden off-field skill, Nicole Yaden. Okay, so the more light skin you are, the more freedom you have to change your racial group to be both black or white or mixed race, whatever the heck it is. And you see a lot of changing with that. But the more darker skin you are, the more confined you are within the boundaries of your minority racial group. And so I think that that's probably what's going on. And it's not like, I first had theorized it was like a zero-sum game, or that's not the right way. I first theorized that people who looked racially ambiguous, as in having like mathematically an in-between skin tone between black and white, that those were the people who have this maneuverability to don a both black or white identity. But it's not. It's a linear relationship where the lighter skin you get to any point gives you increased freedom to identify and be accepted and as a proxy for having the characteristics of any different group that you want. So there's not a lot of good skin color things. And Nicole and I talk all the time about trying to do something on that. But one, it's really hard to measure because self-expressed racial skin color is endogenous. People who think they're blacker than they are going to put darker skin tone than they might actually have in the real world. So that's why it's a really tough thing to study. This might be best left to the qualitative people too. But it is a really good question. I do think that's great intuition. I think a lot of that is going on, but unfortunately, we can't look at it too directly.
I was just gonna say, it's really tough to also measure cross-racially, right? So what constitutes as American, totally different among Asian API folks, totally different among Latinx people, totally different among whites, right? So if you're trying to do any kind of cross-racial comparisons, like we had an hour-long conversation in 2008, MCFDF, just about, okay, would we say Tiger Woods is dark skin? Would we say, like, because we were trying to find like a person that people could compare themselves to as like a standard reference that would be translatable across all the different races in the different languages, and so it becomes really tough to kind of tease that color, spectrum out across racial groups.
Totally. The thing I would say is there's a psychologist, Sarah Gaither, Kim Pauker, Pauker, who study this, who study faces, skin color and external categorizations and how that and stuff like that in psychology, in case that's ever helpful. Gaither, Gaither.
And Beshla Weaver, and I'm thinking if we're getting.
The colorism.
Jennifer,
And Jennifer
I've looked at it in terms of criminal sentencing, right? And seeing that dark skinned criminal defendants get harsher sentences than lighter skinned criminal defendants.
Yeah.
Lots of different places, but measures are tough. Any other questions online, maybe?
Yeah, this ties into what we were just talking about. Does so-called light-skinned privilege apply to people who are both biracial or light-skinned black or two black parents?
I don't know. I mean, I would assume it applies to both, right? I mean, I don't think that I have super expertise here. What I find more interesting about that question is, or what I find interesting, why I like that question is because it kind of gets at this thing I stress about a lot, which is how do we identify who's biracial in the first place? Because even if we're looking at parents' race, this is like pulling behind the curtain of my own study, right? Even if you look at the parents' race, those parents might have different race parents themselves. We might have different race grandparents. And so the way that they choose to identify and present themselves to their children is endogenous. So what do? Do you measure the proportion of race in someone's blood? Hell fucking no, you don't. You know what I mean? So some people, like I was in South Africa because it's the only place in the world in Cape Town, the very bottom, where I could be in a room with people who look just like me. You have the colored population, and that is an interesting thing to never have been in a room with people who look like you, and to finally be in a room with like all your sisters and whatever the hell. But in South Africa, you know that if you are not like 100% genetically black, you are not considered black there. You're considered colored, right? But in the United States, it's different. So there's clearly some mixing that's been going on. And so even among most Blacks in the United States, there's some permeability to call back to a white ancestor or something. This is the idea of racial passing. This is kind of a long story phenomenon. So I think, so I base this, I define race as the way people see their parents, and that's it. And that seems to be gets you pretty close, because the way people define the race of their parents is very stable across time. But yeah, long story short, I do believe that probably light skin privilege, anybody with light skin gets away with that stuff. Great question.
This one is, do you think the way celebrities identify affect how biracial people choose to identify?
Not really. I don't think so. I don't think so. Maybe there's a chance. Yeah. I mean, I think probably when Tiger Woods came out as Coblin Asian or whatever he calls himself, because he's Caucasian, a bunch of other things, that encouraged people or gave them kind of the confidence, this concept of identifying with two or more things is now psychologically accessible. So they think, okay, this is actually a thing people do. I'm going to go ahead and identify with two groups like that. But I will say, like, Barack Obama identifies as just Black, and I don't know that like made Black whites want to identify with just one or not. I also think celebrities identifying with groups is super strategic. They're doing it to signal whatever the hell they want to at a given time, you know. Yeah, and that affects, I think there's an interesting study in like the elite side race, why people choose to identify with one group or the other. And so we did a study that took biracial candidates, people who we told respondents that these candidates had a Black parent, white parent, Asian parent, white parent. And then we varied the way that person identified. And we assessed the effects on how people perceived them, right? And I think I can forget all the findings. So white respondents absolutely hated anybody who defied hypodescent and identified with their minority group or with their higher status group. So if you're Asian and white or Black and white and you identified as white people hated you. But you had to adhere to hypodescent and you had to identify only with your minority category, and then you had like these equal chances to be voted for or supported or whatever. Biracials, people who identify with both racial groups, they loved the people who did the same. They appreciated their kind of, and they also, I think across the board, everybody hated people who identify with their single race category. By hated, I mean we're much less likely to say that they would vote for them or that they find them trustworthy and those kinds of things. But there's an interesting story. Danielle Lemmy does a lot of great work on the elite side of biracials, multiracials, and that kind of thing.
How do you think nativity and like immigration, or just like immigrant generation, how does that play into how people sort of stuff like that?
I don't know. I think I've heard stuff about a non-linear trajectory for Latinos. And I haven't been able to like corroborate this. I wish that I could. If someone knows where this stuff comes from, please let me know. But I think that and this would apply to biracials, because if like you had a first generation immigrant come in and they intermarried, you would be technically second generation, right? And you could also have somebody who's fourth, fifth, later generations. So these are different circumstances. I believe that this is Efrain Perez was telling about this, and I for some reason I haven't been able to find literature. There's a nonlinear relationship in that when people first come from Latin America, they actually have a higher aspirations of donning white identity because they perceive it as tantamount to American. So Efrain says his wife is first generation, and she doesn't really care about Latino identity. Efrain is second or third generation, and he cares a ton about Latino identity. Because I think it's trying to symbolically buy back into your minority racial group because you understand discrimination or whatever the reason might be. So I do think that matters. I have sometimes tried to like account for the different generations, but then you get really small sample sizes and stuff. But you know, I truthfully don't know the answer to that question. I bet you there are differences. I just don't know what they are. It would be really cool to look at that if there was ever data to do that. And I'll keep that in mind. That's a good question.
Any chance the nation state data has any asking out of pure self-interest for a question I'm working on?
Oh, really? Do they have?
No, I'm asking, do they have any kind of like immigrant status or
Right.
citizenship data in that data set?
Oh, yeah, they ask you if you're born in the US.
They do ask.
They do, I'm pretty sure. And they also ask what your language is at home, I think.
Thank you.
But yeah, and Pew has a bunch of questions like that. So there's a Pew data set, the 2015 Pew survey of multiracials. It is phenomenal. They have all types of questions. And it's totally public. I could just send it to you if you want me to, I'll email you the script.
Mine?
And
Yeah.
the script and the data and the questionnaire.
Thank you.
I've been cleaning it for years. It's like the second year of grad school, so.
Wow, so in good shape I am.
It's like so disgustingly unorganized. But I'll send you something, hopefully, let me know.
Any other questions, Macy?
Not online.
No, any questions in the room? If not, we're almost at time and we can say thank you to.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
So folks, please join us again on February 28th, which is a Wednesday, not a Thursday. We'll have Dr. Gary Painter coming up from the University of Cincinnati to give a talk about housing and homelessness.
Oh, cool.
So thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's great to.